Time now for Eye on Africa. Coming up, the head of Sudan's opposition backs the protesters, says it's time for President al-Bashir to make way for a new government. In Zimbabwe, rights groups say they have reports of security services raping a woman as a crackdown on protest continues. With another round of Central African Republic peace talks underway, we report on how football's helping to build bridges in Bangui. That's joining us. We start in Sudan, where protests against Omar al-Bashir's government continued this Friday. Security forces again clashing with crowds a day after the biggest demos seen in the country in living memory. Opposition leader Sadiq al-Mahdi has now officially backed the protesters, saying it's time for the president to step down and make way for a transitional government. France 24's James Vecina has more.
He claims that over 50 people have been killed since the protests began. Speaking from a mosque on Friday, the leader of the opposition, Sadiq al-Mahdi, threw his support behind the anti-government protesters, calling on President Omar al-Bashir to resign.
This regime must leave immediately, and it must be replaced by a transitional national government.
Hundreds of supporters who'd attended Friday prayers then marched through the streets of Omdurman before police fired tear gas to break up the groups. The head of the National Umma Party, which was ousted in 1989 after the coup that swore Bashir into power, said he'd signed an agreement with the Sudanese Professional Association, who were leading the anti-government campaign. At least 2 people died in demonstrations the day before, including a 24-year-old who was reportedly hit by live ammunition. This brings the official toll to 30 dead, a figure that rights groups claim reaches at least 40. The protests began just over a month ago, following Bashir's government's decision to triple the price of bread. Inflation in Sudan has soared to 70%. And after 30 years of Bashir's iron fist rule, opponents are showing no sign of backing down.
Elsewhere, Zimbabwe's High Court has deferred a decision on whether to free an activist pastor accused of stoking anti-government protests. Ivan MAWARIRES will remain in detention until next week at least now. But as Human Rights Watch said it had reports of security forces raping women during an ongoing crackdown on the demonstrations. Violence has raised fears that President Emerson Mnangagwa's government is returning to the methods of his predecessor, Robert Mugabe. France 24's Laurent Vertier has more.
The sun was about to rise in Kidoma when Tafadzwa made a crucial mistake, stepping outside to take a phone call. The young man says he was grabbed and brutally beaten by several soldiers and policemen without any explanation.
The pain was just too much. I feel like I'm going to die. That was the end of me.
The town of Kidoma has been the scene of some of the worst violence since demonstrations broke out across Zimbabwe on January 14th. With soldiers patrolling the streets daily, residents live in constant fear of being arrested or beaten, and those who risk going outside make sure to get back home by nightfall. An unofficial curfew that also extends to shops and businesses after several stores were looted during the protests.
It might take us a year to recover. We've lost roughly $70,000 to $80,000 worth of stock. But fortunately, we managed to escape and we weren't injured.
Tensions have flared in Zimbabwe since the government decided to double the price of fuel earlier this month, sparking anger over a larger economic crisis and skyrocketing inflation. Several people have been killed since the start of the protests in what's being labeled a nationwide security crackdown. President Emerson Mnangagwa, who was elected in 2017 on a promise to revive the economy, has vowed to punish any soldiers guilty of misconduct. But in Kidoma, locals believe security forces have been given full authority to quash the unrest.
We get some more African news in brief now, and Nigeria's opposition has accused President Muhammadu Buhari of what it called an act of dictatorship after the country's top judge was suspended. That just weeks ahead of an election in which the judiciary could play an important role. Walter Onagan is accused of breaching asset declaration rules. Buhari is seeking a second term on February the 16th. Nigerian judges have helped resolve disputes in past polls marred by violence and vote rigging. One of South Africa's top academic institutions, the University of Pretoria, has told the BBC it's changing its official language from Afrikaans to English. The university said the move was needed to transform the culture. The word apartheid is an Afrikaans one, and using the language in education has long been a means of discrimination against black students. 2 more UN peacekeepers have been killed and several wounded in Mali. The pair, who were from Sri Lanka, were travelling near Douentza in the centre of the country, where their vehicle was hit by a mine. Casualties come less than a week after al-Qaeda gunmen killed 10 Chadian peacekeepers in the northern town of Aguelhok. Some 14,000 UN personnel were deployed to counter the jihadist threat in Mali in 2013. Central African Republic's top soccer executive has appeared before ICC judges over war crimes allegations. Patrice Edouard Ngasona, who sits on the board of the Confederation of African Football, is charged with coordinating so-called anti-Balaka Christian militia. They're held responsible for deadly attacks on Muslims during the intercommunal violence that began in the Central African Republic in 2013. Ngasona was arrested in France in December. He denies all charges. The latest attempt to forge peace in the Central African Republic got underway on Thursday with African Union brokered talks in Khartoum. In terms of efforts on the ground, meanwhile, evidence that football can be a force for good. This from our team in Bangui, Indira Eteng, Pierre Agpro, and Zigoto Chaya.
On the walls of buildings in this Bangui suburb, signs of war are still visible. Scores of houses were destroyed in the Kilometre 5 neighborhood. To thousands of Muslims, this enclosure is home in Bangui. Before now, the area was considered as one of the most dangerous for non-Muslims in the Central African Republic capital. But recently, things have changed around here, as young amateur footballers from all faiths have buried their religious differences around this playground. A football tournament encouraging the reconciliation of Christians and Muslims is ongoing. It is an initiative spearheaded by this local businessman from the Kilometre 5 area.
People on the other side of town think that Kilometre 5 is still a very dark and unsafe place. We want to change this narrative. With these young people, we can push for development in this country. All we need is a change of mindset. We can attain development if we think like the youth.
Using football to change minds and put out hate and fear. Arsene is a Christian. He has successfully extinguished his fear of Muslims and this neighborhood.
There was a time when we could not even pass around here. There were just a handful of people. To see people here watching the game is proof that social and peaceful coexistence is real. People are putting aside their fears.
Despite acts of violence still recorded in parts of the country, locals express a strong desire for peace to reign. Those gathered at this field have one uniting factor: their love for football. A sure way to forget about the conflict and try to resume a normal life.
We missed playing football here. We have not been to this place in a while. You see, football is passion, and football unites people from different races and cultures. Our parents, both Christians and Muslims, lived side by side over several decades. And then there was the conflict that brought about all this hate. So it's important that we go back to living happily together.
A peaceful cohabitation initiative which comes at a time when government and armed groups are working towards resuming the peace talks process in Khartoum.
That's it for Eye on Africa. Do stay with us here on France 24.